A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We trust you've had a good lunch, and we hope the discussions keep you from nodding. We are now at an extremely important session that's also being broadcast on the UN networks live, so it's on live stream. And my indicator for success of the session is that many people as possible speak and no one dominates the time, because you won't get airtime, but it is being beamed. In terms of the statistics on the Twitter right now, it's close to 20,000 in tweets and retweets, and all the papers, and there's a lot of discussion going on the social media, a lot more than we expected, so it is very, very global. It gives me pleasure to moderate this afternoon session, and firstly to introduce the discussants who already have joined us on stage. On my left is Cobus van der Merwe from South Africa, and he's from the Public Service Commission. Joining him is Martha McGuire from Canada, the Canadian Evaluation Society representative to and treasurer of the IOCE board. Welcome. And Clesencio Tizikara from Ghana, the Monitoring and Evaluation Specialist, Forum for Agricultural Research in Africa. And the format would be like we've had previously. We'll have two rapporteurs making brief inputs. I will then pose a question to the group. They will give quick responses, and then the floor is open to you for reactions and responses. We'll try and capture as much as possible. We cut, and then I move on to the next question, and similarly. So this is a good opportunity for all of you to get your faces on the global network. So have your question prepared. But please, a question is followed by a question mark at the end, so no speeches at the session. With those few words, it gives me pleasure to call the rapporteurs, and do I have both of them here now? Yes, I do. The President of the Community of Evaluators of Sri Lanka, the COE, Malika Samaranka, can you please come through and provide your input? Thank you.
Very much, Indran. Okay. Well, I must confess right at the beginning, there was such a rich discussion that was going on in the 6 groups, and I'm afraid I may not be able to capture all those in-depth discussions. So it will be only the very salient features that came out from the facilitators of the different groups that I'll be presenting to you. Well, we started with the presentations by, excuse me, I have to remember the names. Yes, Stephanie and Doha, who made the thematic presentation, and they were emphasizing the need for tools and methodologies to be placed in context of the country and the type of evaluation that is being implemented. And of course, about establishing the credibility, they were of the view that it is not an easy task. For example, an example was given from United States, where they are receiving at least 2 to 3 evaluation reports per day. So we can imagine the quantum of information that is being generated and how far we can make use of them for the development process is by itself an issue that we need to face. So with that, we went into 6 groups, and the questions that were asked about the credibility is, the first question was, what management arrangements are needed for establishing credibility? And this group, they came up with, of course, we have provided a format for them. What are the key challenges? Are there any solutions that you can propose? And also to see whether they could come up with suggestions of partnerships that need to be established for establishing the credibility of evaluations by themselves. So one of the issues that this group came up with, or one of the key challenges, was the bias of issue and inequity of power, whether people can influence the evaluation process itself was something that came up for discussion. And the general issue is the inadequate involvement of the key stakeholders and the beneficiaries. You have to consider independence, impartiality to different stages. You need to involve stakeholders from the beginning and also share the results transparently. So in order to avoid biases, that was the issue that was highlighted. And the solution suggested by the group is an issue of how to balance the involvement of the different stakeholder groups. Because we have if you look at the structure, we have the policymakers, we have the decision makers, we have the implementers, then of course we have the beneficiaries who ultimately matter in making a change in their lives through evaluations, if it is to be treated as a learning process. So that itself is a challenge, and mechanisms to involve stakeholders from the beginning and also share the results transparently was one of the solutions that they were proposing, but the process itself was not quite outlined there. So it is left for us to think about how we can make it happen, how to involve all the stakeholders. Yet another issue brought up by that group was about the integrity of the data that is being generated through the evaluation. And one of the solutions that was proposed by the group is to establish a Data Protection Act in the country. And I think one or two examples that were coming up was, one is from Egypt, where Data Protection Act has been in the process of being implemented. Then the third issue that this group brought up is the need to have a coherent institutional setup balanced between the different state powers, which certainly is a challenge. And who decides what is being evaluated also has an influence or an impact on the credibility of the evaluations. That's what they were thinking. So the solution proposed by that group is we are aiming for a degree of impartiality. Several countries are moving towards that. Structural independence of policy, example, in UK was a point of reference made. In Honduras, the system involves consensus with civil society organizations, which is supported by legislation. So in other words, it is a legislative enactment that promotes the credibility of evaluations through that institutional mechanism. Then coming to another challenge identified that group was the limitation of the dissemination of the results of evaluations. So one of the suggestions as a solution proposed by the group is that there should be an agency, an intermediary that is responsible for dissemination the results. Then there is yet another challenge, that is the weak evidence base, insufficient coverage. And that also means the context, the funds, the focus of evaluation that are to be identified at the beginning itself. So I will rush to the second group, that is what management arrangements, okay, so that I have finished. Next one, because I don't have much time, I'm trying to see how best I could just crystallize. The second one, how to institutionalize participatory approach in evaluation and evaluation mechanisms. What are the concrete practices and solutions? I'm sure that group went into a lot of discussion, but that cannot be summarized in a few minutes like this. But the highlights are lack of understanding about monitoring and evaluation as one of the issues that came up. Then the solution proposed is to communicate on monitoring and evaluation and create awareness on the difference, and also treat monitoring and evaluation as a right of the people. so that they have a right to have access to that information and the findings. Second one, lack of rules and mandate for stakeholder involvement as an issue. Establish rules and mandates to ensure stakeholders are involved right from the beginning, design stage, implementation stage, as well as when you are drawing conclusions. And there was a lot of discussion on that the findings of the evaluation is not shared with the people who even help to generate the data and the information during the evaluation. It doesn't go back to them as a feedback session. So that was very much recommended by these groups. Then the third point that was discussed was how to promote transparency in evaluation function. What are the concrete practices and solutions? There should be a general high-level mandate that all evaluation reports be made public. That was one of the recommendations coming from the group. Basically it is, but needs to depend on the purpose and the intended audience who is receiving that information. Then second issue from that group is it is ideal to be inclusive of all stakeholders, but often it is not pursued. Again, it depends on the type of program and the integrity with which the stakeholders are involved. Then third point they brought up was legislative mandate. The other group also mentioned the same thing for evaluation. Then engaging public is a challenge by itself, was an issue. Donor evaluation should be posted on government domain, public domain websites, which is not happening now. Intermediary, another solution given was that it was said by another group also that there should be an intermediary organization which is responsible for dissemination of this information. How practical it is, we need to think about. Then government get politicians to make public comments to evidence of evaluation and also for legislation. Yeah. One more. Three groups. Fourth group was asking the question, how to ensure quality and accuracy of data. What are the concrete practices and solutions? Key issues that came up, non-existence of reliable and disaggregated data. Even though a lot of data has been collected, this issue is still there. And one example given was in Costa Rica, there are structured data collection systems. It is not that it is not there in other countries, but it is a matter of bringing into a systematic process of doing it. Then lack of linkage between data collection and use is still an issue. No checks and balances. So the recommendation is to ensure using triangulation and checks and balances to verify the validity of the data. Lack of homogeneity in information was another issue brought up, and they agree that right at the beginning in the formulation of projects itself, we had to build in the indicators for performance evaluation, and also we had to distinguish between formative and summative evaluation. So summative will look more for numbers, whereas formative evaluation is so qualitative, and therefore we have to see with whom we are going to share that information, because it's a learning process. The other one is more to see what has happened. These were the targets, and have we achieved those targets? That has to be made public. So I will stop at that because we cannot go into more details. But the facilitators have collected it, and I'm sure it will be available for you at the end of these sessions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malika. I know you're only the messenger reporting on what has been given to you, and the actual discussions are much richer, but we will get it captured. I now have pleasure in calling the second rapporteur, Grace Wang, who is from the Poverty Eradication Practice Manager for South-South Cooperation and the lead advisor in the Bureau for Development Policy of the United Nations Development Programme, to give her input. Grace.
Okay, so first, thank you very much for the 60 to 70 participants who joined the Solution Forum 2 on credibility. And the discussion was so rich and so exciting. I was personally very inspired by our insights and knowledge. And also thank you to the three discussants, Danish, Gabriela, and Marco. Thank you very much. We discussed similar issues as what was explained at the Solution Forum 1, but we also have participants volunteered and proposed 2 other topics that we also discussed in depth. So let me just focus on what are the issues and concrete actions that could follow up this agenda. I would not go into challenges because in the afternoon, too much challenges would be very depressing after our lunch. So the first issue we talked about is also management practices. What are the management arrangements that can best ensure impartiality? So there we hear from Brazil their mixed approach in managing evaluations, while ensuring impartiality, but also balancing insider knowledge with external objectivity. And a table, is designated to discuss that agenda. A concrete follow-up action was proposed to say that we need standards, national standards for credible evaluations. And that development of national standard for credible evaluations could be supported through different mechanisms. In some cases, for example, through VOPs, but in other cases, it could also be supported through parliamentary networks. In countries where such evaluation function was directly institutionalized into parliaments. So that is one concrete thing that several countries feel very relevant that could exchange. Second, we discussed data quality and credibility. And there, we hear, demands from several countries talking about we need to share good practices of how to validate data using alternative multiple sources of data. And that is shared among Dominican Republic, Uganda, Malawi, Suriname. So that, I'm sure other countries may have similar needs of sharing good practices in how to validating data. The third issue we discussed is, of course, the engagement with civil societies. And here, the challenge is, it's not that civil societies are not involved or engaged, but the dialogue between government and civil society, the interaction is not as effective and strategic as we would desire. So how to do that? There is, of course, some discussion about experiences in institutionalizing engagement of civil societies and unions and government departments in Brazil, in Mexico, and that was a very interesting experience and could be helpful to countries in Caribbean region. But also there's another, I think, very innovative idea suggested. In Trinidad and Tobago, they are already starting to establish civil society board per sector so that government and civil society dialogue can be managed more strategically. And then within the sector, the civil society voices can be, more integrated and stronger and strategic to dialogue. And it also helps cross-sector dialogue because they have representatives now for their voices. So that was discussed with Jamaica and St. Lucia and, people around the table. So they find this kind of experiences could be jointly, collectively thought through and share experiences. The fourth issue we discussed is culture. Oh, that is proposed by the participants themselves on the spot, and it generated so much enthusiasm. This is about how to incorporate culture and value considerations into evaluations. So a concrete follow-up action is also discussed that evaluator associations in Latin America region and Africa region already started to initiating the joint conceptualization and the action to study how to enrich evaluation methodologies to incorporate cultural dimensions. The discussions around the table helped to broaden the concept into, it is not just about methods, methodologies, it's an approach to be culturally sensitive and adaptable for evaluations. Broader interest generated from many countries, and we thought a concrete thing to do is, we all know before this conference we had online community of practice to engage people interested in the topic. Now this, how to incorporate culture and value considerations into evaluation, could be a topic if we are going to follow this conference, continue community of practice dialogue. Also it is shared that it's likely in 2014, next year, if that momentum is generated, maybe a workshop on this could be a very helpful way to get people together to concretize the action plans. Issue number 5 for the minutes number 5 is it's also generated from the participants themselves. It's about how do you maintain the credibility of evaluation, standing firmly on evaluation agenda, even if you are under political pressure. So that a lot of discussion about the need to not shy away from evaluation agenda in front of political agenda, and experiences from Israel was shared about dialogue even before planning stage to maintain and to make public the evaluation agenda. And that was also felt very relevant to many countries. That of course relates to another topic we discussed about data transparency. Brazil shared, the publication of macro data kind of practice, and also we hear from Finland the public hearing mechanism for evaluations. These are all, very good ways to ensure transparency. However, in many countries, the demand is, how about those politically very sensitive data? How do you manage communication on those data? So there are experiences, maybe case studies that could be done in many countries. For example, India shared some, examples. I wouldn't mention concretely, but there are ways of managing sensitive data, which resulted in a real change in government policy. I'm sure in many countries, and as practitioners, you all have experienced that, and it's, but have we documented that? Have we shared that? How to manage the sensitive data under political pressure? Either is gradual, constructive, incremental, or is another, more radical approach. No matter what, as long as it worked in your context, we should document and share. So these are the 5 key points and 5 solutions. I still have 2 minutes. I won't use that. Finally, a concrete idea to suggest for the conference organizers. Since yesterday and today, there are several concrete actions already proposed. I thought it might be good that tomorrow, if there will be some posters, post up somewhere with those concrete proposals. And if you are interested as a participant into that subject, just sign your name and country on, and in the future we'll see, what would be the way to facilitate that kind of networking and possible partnership. Who knows? We just sow the seeds here, and there might be something important happening after this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grace, for those inputs. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a lot to chew on, but in terms of the format, we will now pose a question that each of the 3 respondents here would make a comment on, and then it's over to you. And if I could just invite you to state your name and country for the purpose of record. And the questions that I have to pose is to the colleagues is, what have you seen or experienced that has helped to either ensure or to strengthen evaluation credibility? And the profile of the persons on stage are those that have been on the ground, who should be able to talk experientially from this, and then we hand over to you. I will call upon the gentleman on my left.
Yeah, I think in my experience, the factors that have been raised in the morning determining evaluation credibility are the things that one should consider. So on my list is nothing new. Some of the things that I've listed is the expertise of the evaluator, credible methodology, answering the right evaluation questions, the independence of the institution doing the evaluations, the reputation of that institution, and so on. But I think the main point I want to make around these issues, and I'll make a few illustrations, is that in bodies, in evaluation bodies with limited resources, we've this morning sort of heard about the American Audit Office, or I'm not sure what they call it, with thousands of evaluations every year. Those big organizations, I suppose, have more maneuverability around their resources. But in a small institution like I'm working for the Public Service Commission in South Africa, none of these points you can solve in any absolute sense. So the one is played off against the other. So if it gets, for instance, to the expertise of the evaluator in South Africa, we are just beginning to see postgraduate specialized diplomas in monitoring evaluation. But in many instances, we get people with general social science degrees. So your evaluator does not necessarily, is not necessarily the highest expert that you can get, and his own confidence is not necessarily so good, or the other side of it, the institution being evaluated or the program managers being evaluated might not have the confidence in that specific evaluator. So consequently then, getting to the next issue of credible methodology, what one then tends to do is to use standardized tools or standardized methodology, because as soon as you standardize the methodology, it's easier for you to train your evaluator. But that then plays off against the whole issue of which evaluation questions can you answer, because using that standardized methodology, you can't answer any evaluation question. You need to pick your questions that you are confident you can answer well. Consequently, the institution that you are working for must then also be modest in what it can offer. It can't tell people they are able to answer any evaluation question. That is not true in practice. It also then helps for that institution to do the same thing over a number of years, so that you can, so that your evaluators can be trained or get experience or get better in doing the same thing for quite a while. Also, one tends to improve your product over time. So if you every year tackle another evaluation question or another type of evaluation, your evaluators are less confident every time you tackle a new thing. And I think I just want to stop there. One can also, in the same manner, show how some of the other factors influencing credibility can't be answered or can't be solved always in an ideal manner. One play off the one against the other and offer a product that you are confident in, but you can't be all things for all people.
Okay, well, I guess I want to start by reinforcing the complexity of the term credibility. And when I thought about the things that go into credibility, I could have had a list of 30 things. I could have taken 3 days to talk about all of those things, but I have 5 minutes, so there you go. But the things that hit the top of my list were ethics. And I have a bit of a passion about that, because I think if you start off with ethics, that in fact what follows is more likely to produce a credible evaluation. And of course, standards. And there are standards. There's the UNEG norms and standards. Different countries have their own standards. there's lots of resources to think about standards, and you can, having looked at a number of them, there's a lot of consistency across standards. So I guess one of the things I've concluded is no matter what standard you go with, you will likely cover most of the bases. But it's important also to think about context. A third thing for me is competencies. I come from Canada, where we have a credentialing program, the professional designation program. And one of the things in moving towards that, we spent a lot of time thinking about competencies. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that now, because the second question will give me that opportunity. So I'm going to talk more about that later. A third thing, or fourth thing, is appropriate design, that it's appropriate for the situation. And I guess I'm not sure if I understood fully, but I'm not sure we entirely see eye to eye on sort of standardization, because I believe that credible evaluations can't take a standardized approach, but they must meet standards, which is a slightly different way of using it, and it could just be a difference in language. Then quality control is an extremely important factor, and I think the people who are going to be receiving the information from the evaluation need to know that that is there, and that relates to transparency. Finally, stakeholder involvement, or second to last is stakeholder involvement, and involving them in a way that is appropriate allows you to get a better understanding of the context, allows them to get a better understanding of the evaluation. And then finally is something I actually haven't heard here, and it's another complex concept, is trust. The building of trust in a way that still maintains your independence is a really critical factor. So, and I will stop and pass it on to you.
Thank you, Martha.
Okay, thank you. I limit my intervention on two elements with respect to credibility, and one is what I call the compelling evidence. You know, when you do the evaluation, is what evidence is there, you know, that you can base on to say, yes, this is credible, this is not. And there are two things involved here. One is the plausibility of the data you are using and how consistent it is and how valid it is will certainly have a very big influence on the credibility of your evaluation. Now, from the African experience, particularly in the agricultural sector where I work, we've had big problems with the amount of data that is collected in various forms, and you come to use it for evaluation and you find, you can't put pieces together, particularly in programs that are looking at performance of the continent, as a whole. And part of what we've come up with is to sort of agree collectively on what we call a mutual accountability framework. Agree on the key standard data that you must capture, agree on how you capture it, and that forms a basis for your future evaluations. And we've been pushing for this and using it, particularly in looking at how we are performing against the what we call the comprehensive agricultural development program for Africa, the CADAP. The second element I think involved here is when we talk of, and my two colleagues have mentioned it, the credentials of the institutions or the individuals doing the evaluation. It's a very has a big influence on the credibility. Now, we place a lot of emphasis on, yes, the expertise, the prestige of the institutions or the individuals doing the evaluation. But sometimes, is how much trust do you put in these, yes, they have the expertise, we trust them, but they also have their biases, they have their preferences, and sometimes, they can lead you, into wanting to believe what they believe in that may not necessarily be the most suitable conclusion in the context in which you are operating. The second aspect I want to talk about is, the convincing arguments. Yes, you may have the evidence, you may have the data, but how do you write it up? How do you put it across to the evidence, to the audience that is supposed to use it? Now, in evaluation, we have a language that we use. We have, certain terminologies that mean, have a specific meaning. Now, if you are going to do an evaluation, and then you write it up in a form that, distorts the meaning of those terms, or compare, or you don't give adequate interpretation or sufficient explanation on what the results you have got out of your evaluation mean, then you leave the whole evaluation open to interpretation by whoever is reading it. So if we are not going to be very specific, if you don't become very specific and give a true interpretation, then you leave it to whom it may concern. Everybody will have their own opinion, and it becomes very difficult, to manage, particularly, these divergent views, because I think part of the issue with credibility is, you are either with them or you are against them, you are not with them. And all this is, I think, a lot of, personal opinion. What are my preferences? What is my theory of knowledge? Where do I come from? What is my foundation? And therefore, I take a decision based on some of those considerations, to decide whether an evaluation is credible or not. I think I'll stop here for the time being.
Thank you very much for those inputs that clearly reflect a tremendous amount of experience and resonates with what we have been discussing so far. Before handing over to you for your comments and reactions, three themes that seems to emerge, and the first one deals with the issue of humility. We need to be very modest on what we can do, given our resources, both human and financial. The second element, also a personal factor that comes in, is the question of trust. And the third input goes back to a personal factor, the credentials of the institution or individual. So it would emerge that when we're talking about credibility, it's not some abstract concept. You're really getting to the soul of the evaluators and their institutions. I now have pleasure in calling for reactions and questions, and we will have a roving mic. I'll take a few. Open. So if I could just take numbers first, show of hands, and then I will allocate. So it's 1, 2, and we're trying to get global representation, so okay, we'll take those 2 questions for now. And 3, thank you.
Hans Bomer from the World Bank. I was very much taken by the issue of trust. And if you could elaborate a little bit on whose trust are you trying to gain and how do you go about it?
In terms of the marking, we had a second presenter and the third. We'll take 3.
Thank you. Ms. McGuire spoke about ethics and standards, and I think we often talk about them, but how do we translate them into applying to actually have a mechanism to put an evaluation through an ethics process and to assess or quality assess an evaluation based on standards, so applying concepts.
Third gentleman, while you're getting the mic, it related to standards. How does one put it in place? Okay.
Donc, merci pour les intervenants et puis pour le travail de groupe de réflexion. Moi, je dis qu'on n'a pas suffisamment creusé la problématique. Parce que la crédibilité dépend de beaucoup de choses et qui sont bien connues et ont été listées par les groupes et par les... Mais la difficulté qui se pose, c'est la mise en œuvre réelle de cette crédibilité sur le terrain. En particulier quand on s'adresse à une population. Une politique qui s'adresse à une population et comment elle est crédible vis-à-vis d'une population. Donc ça, c'est une grande question qui reste posée par rapport à la politique. Généralement, les politiques sont conçues de haut, elles sont appliquées sur le bas. Et par conséquent, cette crédibilité est en jeu. Et merci.
Thank you very much for those 3 questions. I'll hand over to the panel to respond to them, either individually or as a collective.
When I speak of trust, I think one of the things for an evaluation to be credible, it's the evaluator who must be trusted and who must make some effort to gain that trust through a number of different mechanisms. And it has to do with honesty, transparency, appropriateness, equity. Those sorts of things go into building trust. You know, for example, if you're thinking about gender equity, doing an evaluation in which the participants, the recipients of a service are both men and women, you need to think about the perspectives of both men and women and make sure that you get those perspectives and understand not only how they might be different, but also where there are similarities. So that whole business of, from the point that you really start designing your evaluation all the way through, of making sure that people understand what you're doing, that it makes sense to them, and that what you finally present in the end also is supported by, like, the conclusions are supported by the evidence is understood, all of that sort of thing goes into trust. I don't think trust, I mean, on the other side, you want to trust your respondents as you gather data, but I have not found that personally to be a problem, because I think people, I'm amazed always at how open and honest people tend to be and give information sometimes that I'm really surprised at receiving. Does that address it?
Yeah, I think moving to Christelle's question around standards, I think the question has 2 parts. On the one hand, the standards that the evaluator must conform with, and then the standards that the product or the evaluation itself must conform with. And I think in the long run, I know it is controversial, but in the long run, one will have to move to accreditation of evaluators. But to start that off with, one should simply be much more precise in how you define a job when you advertise it. One wouldn't be able, I think, to continue with just requiring a general social science degree. One will have to begin to specify it much more tightly. And the same will apply to the standards that the evaluation itself must conform with. It's even more controversial because the immediate question is who will then now set itself up as a standards checking body or an evaluator of evaluations body. At the Public Service Commission in South Africa, we at a stage did start with a program on meta-evaluations. we realize that apartments and many other bodies in South Africa do evaluations, and we probably need not to do too many of them ourselves, but then the whole question about the credibility of those evaluations. But we haven't, in the last year or so, continued with that, because you immediately say you are in a position to judge other people's work, and I think that is a bit controversial. But if you really want to apply standards, I suppose one will have to go in that direction. The last question, if I can also move to that, the way I understood it is that it talked about the credibility of public policies, which I think is a little bit different, and I think evaluation then probably plays a role in the credibility of public policy, because if the evaluation found the policy to be working, it will give it credibility, and if the evaluation says it's not working, then it will lessen the credibility of that public policy. Except if I understood the question now wrongly.
Okay, let me probably address myself to the last question from our colleague from Morocco. I think as Maria pointed out, in the morning, credibility here we are talking basically, is a negotiation between the methodology and context. Is yes, participatory processes, yes, top down. But I think the whole issue is, is what methods do we use to generate the evidence that, practically, can be used. And we are looking at, from simple elements of looking at the causal effectiveness and productive power of methodologies, quantitative, analysis, to the actual interpretation and meaning of the evaluation results in terms of the perspectives, in terms of the attitudes, in terms of the values of the actual constituents that are going to use that evaluation evidence. And also when you get to the issue of context of the evaluation, credibility is what perspectives are we talking about? Are we talking about, what individuals are saying? Are we talking about, collective perspectives of whole populations? What are we talking about? We need to be very clear, so that, it's not probably, one very noisy bureaucrat in the system that, when he says, no, I don't believe in this, then, you dismiss everything. And, particularly, in the African context, when we are doing all these evaluations, if you come up, however, credible you may think your evaluation is, if the president stands on a podium and says, I don't believe in this, then, everybody, almost the majority of people, think, is useless. You haven't done anything, So these kinds of context, we need to be, very careful. And therefore, we are looking at, the variety of evidence that is used, to establish all these different claims that, are attached to, the evaluation.
Amazing insights. Could we take another round of questions, please? You don't have to confine yourself to what's being stated here. If I could mark the number 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, in reverse order is also fine. Yes. So 1, 2, 3, 4 for this round. Okay.
Thank you. The name is Beverly Best. I'm from the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. I just wanted to get a reaction on 2 issues with respect to credibility, in particular as it relates to the methodology and the appropriateness of design. To what extent, the question is, to what extent do you think there's need for clear definition of the parameters and the boundaries of the methodology, clearly stating what the limitations of the methodologies are? And the other question relates to in terms of the, again, credibility, how practical it is for one to utilize a quality assurance plan in undertaking the evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Hamid Sabri from Afghanistan. My question was specifically on the issue convincing the users with the reports and information of the evaluations. If you could elaborate on that, because when it comes in terms of credibility, we have different people using the information that comes out of evaluation. So which target group are we going, and how you are going to convince the users of different groups? Because is it the actual people who are evaluated or the ones who are going to use for decision making? Thanks.
Thank you. Yes. Third and yeah, first.
Okay. My name is Oyun Tsitsek from Mongolia. Once we gather together to talk about the credibility of the evaluations, we should probably also pay attention on the encouragement of the local evaluation NGOs and other institutions in the monitoring of the international projects and programs. In the practice, for example, in Mongolia, in the procurement of these kind of services, they're pushing in the TOR, they stating very huge standard or, for example, requirement that they should have experience working in the international organizations, or the amount of the service previously done should be no less than $1 million and so on. So therefore, from my experience working in these international organizations, we should somehow encourage local institutions, not just the evaluators, personal individuals, but local institutions to be involved in the international monitoring activities. So what shall we pay on these issues attention when Grace told that we should have some kind of practical steps or proposals from our conference. So maybe we should encourage or make it more in the procurement of these services, like encouragement of the local institutions. So I think it's Naioo, Mr. Naioo will have more answer for this question.
Thank you. We'll take the last two questions or comments, and then I'll close on this subject and then move to the next set. Sorry.
Sorry, I speak French.
French.
Je vais parler français.
I will speak French because the subject of credibility is an important issue that has been widely debated during the exchanges that have taken place before this meeting. Credibility in terms of what, of who, in terms of the comparing the evaluator, the beneficiaries. These are all questions that we need to address to know what we're talking about. The evaluators intervenes very often at the end of the process, but I think we should start at the very beginning. To the policy that we are evaluating, is it actually credible? So it is a reflection that we have to do in depth. We won't have the solution this time at this conference, but I think that the panelists should talk a bit about this credibility too, because what we see very often is that besides the public policies that we can decide on whether they're credible or not, many of them are dictated by the conventions on the financing, the funds that are signed? And is it according to the opinion of the beneficiary, the partners, the financiers? So that's what I wanted to comment. Thank you.
David Roberts from Australia. I'm really interested in this notion of trust because I think it's important. What we're talking about when we're talking about trust is the relationship between the people who use, read, observe and utilise the evaluation, and the relationship between the people who create and develop the reports that go out to people and have the relationships with the consultants, with the beneficiaries of the program. It seems to me that we really need to think about credibility not as something that adheres to the product or the evaluator, but as something that is part of a relationship, and that we need to think about how that works. And I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about that notion of the relationship and what credibility means in relation to that.
Thank you. And
one last.
Sure.
Okay, I'm Tessie Katsambas on the board of the IOCE and Eval Partners. And I just have an observation of a shift that I've seen in this conversation. For those who participated before the conference on the website at the dialogue, there was a bit more emphasis on product, on competencies, on methodology. And then as the day progressed and as our discussion evolved, we are now talking a lot more about a facilitative process, an inclusive process, a political process. And executive government is maybe that's not the biggest skill, and I mean it's a skill, but there is kind of a responsibility for implementation and execution of projects in executive government. So the question to me is that I would like to sort of think about in the future is what kind of competencies and tools and support might be helpful as we start to define the kinds of consultative, inclusive processes that we are now saying are essential for credibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've got 25 minutes to get full response from you and another question. Let me see how good the evaluators on stage are in compressing information and responding. Over to you.
Okay, this is a challenge. And I'm going to be brief because trust is something, David, some of your comments this morning are the things that got me thinking about that, and I really appreciate, Tessie, your noting the transition. And I think one of the things when we talk about competencies, we often think about the technical competencies, but when Indran asks us the second question, I'm going to go into competencies more. And one of the things you'll see is that the technical competencies are just one of 5 different competency domains. So that kind of covers a lot of areas.
Okay. I'll talk about the question that was asked by this colleague, and the issue of convincing arguments. Now, in evaluation, basically, we are talking about presenting evidence, and all this evidence we put on the table, it has a historical perspective, for how information was gathered, what went into its interpretation, and what is involved in its use. Now, all these historical and collective aspects involve evidence. There are other extra evidential elements that are involved, and these are often also, not adequately, articulated. Now, what we need to understand is that, given all these contextual, situations regarding evidences, we ought to be able, to put forward an argument that explains very explicitly the evidence that we are talking about, that we've come up in this, in the evaluation, so that whoever is considering it has that background, has at least, a clear picture of what that evidence entails and means in different contexts. If you leave it, without explaining it in great depth, then, you leave people, who are going to use that evaluation, helpless. They don't know where to start from. And you are actually, leaving, probably, putting them in a situation where they are actually now becoming evaluators themselves to be able to, to interpret the data that you have or the information that you have put in front of them.
Yeah, just perhaps to say something around the users of evaluation. Again, one try to balance things in practice, because I suppose ideally if you identify specifically who is going to use the evaluation, what decision that person needs to take, and what information he needs to take that decision, then you can customize your information gathering and your evaluation to that specific decision and that specific person, and you will know, and you can also customize all the steps you take to make it credible to that person's needs, and then the chances are increased that it will be used. But in an institution like ours, which also constitutionally undertakes evaluations on own initiative, you generalize the evaluation question that you tackle, and then I suppose in many instances it is not as focused as it would have been if you focused it on a very specific decision maker. I think this sort of speaks more to use of evaluation than credibility, but nevertheless.
Thank you very much, and that has not exhausted the first question. Most certainly it's posed more questions, which we need to think about as we deepen the practice. But we may want to reflect again on the excellent presentation this morning by Maria Costello, who started off by stating, and it goes to credibility, the political nature of evaluation. There is a tendency in the training, in the modules, in the discussion, to assume that if you have the right methodology, you solve all the other problems. But if you do not fully understand the political context within which you are conducting an evaluation and take into account those dynamics and the complexities, you may come out with an evaluation that is methodologically sound according to the best standards, but just does not get used because it hasn't taken into account the multiple factors that prevail. And I've seen that a lot in the work of the Evaluation Office of the UNDP, which does country-level evaluations. We've done about 80 in the last decade. We want ultimately to get use, but there's two elements to it, and it goes to credibility. The first is we look backwards and we come up with a judgment. That's the accountability dimension. But moving forward, it means a different stance, and that is the formative evaluation. And are the evaluators who are good at the standards and the accountability dimension also good at the facilitative approach to move forward and empower, which is the challenge that was also posed by our opening address, Rebecca Greenspan, who spoke about the intangibles and what that means. So it's a very powerful concept, but it's something that we need to really grapple with. It's not just about methods. Methods serves a purpose. And we're talking about credibility, and I'm sure every one of us has a story about where an evaluation was rejected, and when they could not hit the methods, they hit the evaluator and say, you're not trained or not skilled. But I think we need to also recognize within our own profession, other professions have accreditation, etc. And I know it's a political debate. I know it's sensitive, but I'm going to say it as an independent office. In all professions, there is some form of accreditation. We would be very concerned jumping into a plane and having a pilot that's not qualified, because they take you somewhere. We make profound judgments that have profound implications, but we get very sensitive when it comes to the issue of competencies and credibility and accreditation. What that means in practice, I don't know, but it's a discussion that needs to happen. It is problematic that many who are conducting evaluations do not have the skill. And it brings to a question that this meeting raised yesterday, which is who evaluates the evaluators, which goes fundamentally back to credibility. And the peer review mechanism, which is something that's being spoken about, where one unit peer reviews in a collegial way another unit, would be an interesting way forward. When I walked into the UNDP, I had my office peer reviewed. Now, get evaluators to evaluate other evaluators. It's interesting. It can be very, very challenging. They tend to be more defensive, right? And they'll question the methodology, etc. Yet that's what we do daily. And they get upset when a finding does not meet what they think they're doing. So we need to really not only look outwards, we need to look inwards. And that goes fundamental to the issue of credibility. If the evaluation units are able to demonstrate an openness and a receptiveness to being critiqued and to engage with this criticism, I think will help in their credibility. And with that note, I ask the next question of our eminent persons: what can be followed up at a country level that can lead to practical implementation and concrete results in terms of promoting credibility of evaluation? Now let's get down to the ground level. Over to you.
Yeah, for me, it is about the things that you have raised, Indran, and that is the quality of your staff, and it is a question of, like I've said, being more precise around how you recruit staff and how you then develop them, much more precise than we are at the moment. And then also on the institutional side, over time, building our institutions, the specific protocols that they follow, the knowledge resource that it builds up over time, retaining that knowledge resource, because if you have a staff turnover, you can quickly lose it again. So for me, it is very basic things like over time. There's no sort of silver bullet. It is building those institutions over time.
Okay, well, at a country level too, you have VOBEs within each country, and VOBEs can make decisions about what they believe to be the important competencies. And it can either be in the context of simply understanding those competencies, having a peer review process, having an accreditation process, but defining those competencies is important. I guess I am also a hirer of evaluators and find that to be extremely important as well. And I don't want to underplay the technical practice because it's critical. I don't know if any of you have experienced it, but I have, where a researcher has dropped a data set into the wrong place and come up with an incredibly different picture that might otherwise have occurred. And without quality assurance systems built in, you don't catch those things, you don't correct them, and presenting something like that to the commissioner of the evaluation or to the program people will undermine credibility. So the technical skills are extremely important. The quality control is extremely important. The articulation of limitations is extremely important. But in addition to the technical things, is reflective practice, which gets back to that looking inwards, and that has to do with standards, ethics, human rights, independence, self-development, and understanding how those work together. There's also situational practice, which means attending to the unique interests, issues, and contextual circumstances. So you can't ignore your surroundings. Another is your management practice. Most evaluations involve a team, or many of them do, and there has to be project management. And that means attending to things like budgeting, coordinating resources, and so forth. Because again, if you think you're going to do something and you don't have the resources for it, you need to figure that out up front, not at the end say, whoops, can't really do what we said we were going to do. And then finally is the thing we've been talking about, is that interpersonal practice, the communication, negotiation, conflict resolution, collaboration, and the appreciation of diversity.
Okay. My contribution is largely, to do with the institutional reforms, at a country level. Now, very much is talked about, evidence-based reforms, results-based management, and all sorts of, jargon that people use down there. But, the basic tenets are good. But when you get to the ground, what do you find? Is people talk about it, but is it actually what is happening or working on the ground? And I think at a country level, where you have all these reforms, particularly, pushing for pluralism, the issues of subsidiarity and competence enhancements, what seems or what normally happens is you shift the power balance and you transfer power from existing structures to new structures, and eventually what happens, you create a new environment of conflict, and in the end, you start having a new set of internal and external rivalries between different units operating within the same system, renewed fragmentation of efforts, and the proliferation of separate models and, initiatives, in the undertaking government business. So I think from, if we are going to improve, particularly, the credibility and use of evaluation information at, the country level, these inconsistencies have to be, really addressed and sorted out, so that, people come to understand the real value of what we are talking about and don't see, these these developments as, issues of power and control in terms of, who decides who is performing best in the system, but rather as a collective responsibility to deliver services to the people that the different interventions we are evaluating are aimed at.
Thank you very much. We've got 4 minutes. A country that has not spoken. We'd be happy to hear from you. We have for this conference, I think, 15 new countries that have joined. And we're very pleased to have you in the evaluation community. If you have anything to say, or comment, or react on credibility. Okay, so it seems that we're coming to conclusion of the session. We do. A country that's not spoken. I'll allow the gentleman to comment. I think you're holding the record of now having attended all 3 NEC events. Okay, no. Okay. In terms of summation, the way this conference has been structured, we spoke about independence yesterday. We had a very clear statement coming from the, UCE, but we had very clear statement, UCE as presented, also from the administrator on the factor of utility and the factor of independence. And today we're discussing credibility. But what should have become clear to all of us now is that these elements do not stand alone. They influence each other. And they're mutually reinforcing, or they affect each other in an adverse way. So to have credibility, independence is a part of it, but if the evaluations are used, you also get utility. And ultimately, if we talk about evaluations should make a difference to change the world and very much of those big outcome issues, use is fundamental. So we need to do whatever is possible to get to the point of use. I cannot do a full summation of the rich discussions that we have had through the Q&A and also the presentations here, but there are certain themes that seem to emerge and we need to take it into discussion. The one point that is quite apparent is there's an issue of skills, and that needs a full discussion which goes into the area of competencies. There has to be some definition. It cannot remain the way it is, where it's almost, in many countries, someone who just graduated is going in and becoming a director of a serious evaluation unit. It's risky, it's dangerous, because if you turn people off with a bad evaluation, or if the evaluation is found to be not credible, you create a climate so bad in the country or place that no one wants to talk evaluation for years to come. So evaluation can be empowering, it can be destructive if it's done wrongly. And part of it is evaluation goes to a very basic human characteristic of fear, because it's about judgment. And that means another dimension that must come in is when we conduct the evaluation and we present the findings, do not forget the people concerned at all levels, both in terms of the recipients and as well as the decision makers. Because if you don't, they will switch off psychologically and choose not to use what you have given. It's clear that it's a political process and was being made clear this morning, and let's not duck from that. Let us understand it and engage. You may not win it, but you have to engage. And it's always political. If you just look at the reactions that come to evaluations that are presented internationally, this is going to be the business. It's going to continue. The final part is the question of policy. It has emerged. Policy protects. It doesn't totally guarantee you will be successful in what you do, but it is important because the profession of evaluation can be career limiting at times. And there needs to be some form of protection for evaluators, that in organizations where you have a professional function, they can continue with their work without fear, favor, or prejudice, and their work is actually respected. And that comes back to the broader issue of professionalization. We've come to the end of this session. I've been asked to make an announcement that the dinner and samba will take place at 8 p.m., giving enough time for other meetings, giving enough time for you to dress for samba. We are in Sao Paulo. As we were coming from the airport, I asked, how is it in Sao Paulo? And the person said, this city, it is sizzling. So let's see how much it sizzles tonight. And that's at 8 p.m. We move into a short break and then the subsequent sessions at this. Any announcements, Grace? This room gets broken up again. Yes, that's right. Yes. And we return in 20 minutes? In 20 minutes. Thank you so much for your attention.